Hello and welcome to a premium deck profile. Today I want to talk about Mythiarq megacolony, which is a deck that has surprisingly started doing pretty well in the format. It had a 100% top conversion rate supposedly at one regional, where all the pilots who took it ended up in top cut. That's pretty phenomenal. And also just it's been surprisingly powerful in my testing, and I think it's a nice new twist on Mega Colony that makes the deck kind of a bit more fun to play, and also makes up for the weaknesses it acquired under the new ban list. So, for those who don't know what this deck does, the deck plays one copy of Gizeh. And playing this one copy of Gizeh will give you access to Zeroth dragons from other nations because of a weird rule that allows you to play Zeroth dragons as long as you have Gizeh in your deck. However, just because it's in your deck doesn't mean you have to pick it as your grade 0 for your starting Vanguard, so we can play this starter. And this gives us access to the Zeroth dragons from other nations, and we're going to play, most notably, Zeroth Dragon of Distancy Megiddo, which is a Megalonica unit. Normally we couldn't stride into this, but because of Gizeh, we can put it in our G-Zone, and then by using a Stoicheia unit Vanguard, we can go into it regardless, because Stoicheia in standard format contains both the Zoo and Megalonica nations, if I remember correctly. So this deck gets access to a powerful late game closer that gives it far more attacks than Mega Colony should ever be allowed access to. And on top of that, we get access to some reasonable synergies that are pretty good, because Mythiarq has actually got some decent support in standard. Even though it's not a meta competitive deck, it's still got some really powerful cards. So let's get into the list, starting, of course, with Gizeh in our starter, which you'll never use Gizeh for anything except maybe discarding for cost or shield value, and then the standard V starter that gives a quick shield. Then we're playing 4 copies of Mythiarq Lurutzel. This is our main grade 3 ride target. It is, in fact, the only thing we want to ride ever. We can occasionally be forced to ride other units, but this is the best one. This has on place on V, look at the top 7 cards of the deck, and choose up to one grade 3 or less unit from among them and call it to R and shuffle, and if you have 5 or more units, your opponent discards a card from hand. That discard can be really powerful because Mega Colony shrinking the opponent's power and restricting their G-Guardians means that oftentimes the opponent just barely survives our 5 attack pattern. Getting one card out of their hand might be the difference between them dying and them living. Then it has a on attack skill that we'll use only if we're going first, or if we somehow couldn't stride. On attack, you counterblast 1 and you bounce a Mythiarq, and then you call a Mythiarq with a different name to circle. And it's an easy 4 attack enabler. With a restander in the other column, you can get 5 attacks, but you need to have Mythiarqs with different names, and we don't really play that many. So overall, pretty good Vanguard. Getting access to Persona Ride is also really good for Mega Colony because the numbers in Mega Colony are not that good. Sure, we can give minus power to the opponent's unit, but at the end of the day, if they hit a defensive or 2, they're back up to where they were, and all of our cards end up being like 1 card guard. So this Persona Ride is really important for pushing through big damage. And on top of that, because we have a restander, we get to double dip the power. So next we have our grade 3 search targets. These are for when you go into the Gredora stride, which finds a grade 3 in the middle of battle phase. So first off, we have Inlet Pulse Dragon. This is a card well known to standard players. It has, at the end of your turn, if you attacked 4 more times, you put this into Soul and draw a card, which builds resources for us, and also can put a grade 3 into Soul to pay for the cost of this card later. Overall, it's a really good, and we can't use the first effect because we're not on Flagberg. Then we have Enlargolf. This is a card that should be a familiar sight to premium players because it's played in a lot of Stoicheia decks, every Grand Blue variant, and most previous Mega Colony variants. This has on place on R or when put on G. Choose it to one grade 4 card from your hand and reveal it. If you reveal the card or your Vanguard is grade 4, you perform the following, depending on which circle you called it to. If it's R, you Soul Blast 1 and choose a grade 2 or greater card with a different name from this unit from your drop and put it in hand. So we can grab grade 3 heals this. We can grab copies of Mythiarq Lurutzel to Persona Ride or pitch to Ultimate Stride later. We can find important pieces like the Restander. It's a really good card overall. And we literally can't use the second skill because we'll never be on grade 4 on the opponent's turn. And then when you discard this for stride, you get to draw a card. So we get a nice little bit of extra value there. Oh, and then this card got mixed up. Then we have 1 copy of Death Warden Antlion. This card has on V or R, when it attacks, you Soul Blast a grade 3 and discard 2 from hand. And until end of the battle, this unit gets 10k and a crit, and your opponent cannot call Sentinels to G from hand. So This is a way to just like surprise one-shot the opponent. They can't G-Guardian when they're under Gredora, and if they're a Protect clan, often the only shield value they'll really have is Protect markers and Perfect guards. And so sometimes if you hit some crits with your Gredora Stride and then you put them all on this card, you can swing in for a 3 to 4 crit and just one-shot the opponent out of nowhere. If they have cards like the Overtrigger in hand or Elementary Sanctitude, they'll safely guard this with no problems. So keep in mind, it's a little niche, but it's really good when it works. Free wins are always nice to have. And then we have my 4 proxies for Mythiarq, Guardian, Delphina. I'll read off the effect. These haven't come in the mail yet, and they might not for a long time, because I apparently ordered them from Singapore. So what this card does is at the end of the battle, your Vanguard with Mythiarq in its name attacked a grade 3 or greater unit. You Soul Blast one and stand this, and it gets 10k power. And then at the end of your turn, if you have 3 or more units with Mythiarq in their names, you can retire this unit and choose a card from your drop with Mythiarq in its name, different from this card, and put it in hand. Now we only have 2 legal targets. I guess technically we have 3 if you count Mythiarq Habitat, because that is a Mythiarq card name. But really, it's just the 2 targets for most of the time, because we only play 1 copy of Mythiarq Habitat. So this is going to be really useful, actually. That skill, sacrificing your Restander, which is a high-value card, to get something back, it doesn't sound that good, but we need a lot of copies of Mythiarq the Ruthzel. We want to Persona Ride when possible, because that pushes through bigger numbers, and we want to have a copy of this in hand for Ultimate Stride. If we can get back 2 copies of this, and then Persona Ride and Ultimate Stride, we can generally close the game out regardless of what the opponent has defensively. And keep in mind that Megiddo, the 0th dragon we're most likely to want to use, calls units from the drop zone. So if all the copies of Delphina are in the drop, we still get a full board of them. So it's not even that big a deal. And when you're not on 0th dragon, if you're on Gredora, you only need 1 Delphina, because Gredora will call another attacker in the battle phase. And then this will stand, so you'll get the same number of attacks regardless. So 4 copies, mandatory 4 of. This card has been bought out on TCG Player. I think copies have just recently gone up for $30 or so, which is a high price. So preferably you should check your old cards, because this was a promo. See if you pulled it. See if your friends pulled it. See if you can find some on eBay or something for cheaper, or on Facebook groups for your local area. Just dig around. Somebody has a copy of this, and if you find 4 people who have a copy of it and trade for each one at less than $30, you'll save some money. Or if you can borrow the cards for when you go up to a regional, even better. Next, we have 3 copies of Elite Mutant Giraffa. This is our best grade 2 attacker besides the Restander. This has auto on V or R when it attacks, counterblast 1, and this unit gets 5k for each of your opponent's resting rear guard. And then if your opponent has 1 or less standing rear guard, you draw a card. So counterblast 1, draw bare minimum, because we almost always will have no standing units on the opponent's side. And then potentially plus 25 or more if you're playing against an Excel clan. To this card means it hits for pretty big numbers, because 34 is really good when the opponent is at negative 20 from their starting base power. And then all of your opponent's rear guards on the same column as this unit cannot intercept or move. So we can take away one of the ways the opponent gets value out of those stunned units that can't stand. If they intercept with them, they get at least a little bit of shield value, but by taking away intercepts, we make those cards essentially worthless. Then we have 2 copies of Charming Mutant Sweet Cocktail. This card has, when rode over, you generate a Cradle Marker and put it on one of your opponent's rear guards. The Cradle Marker takes away its base power. It gives it no abilities, and when the card is retired, you get to search your deck for a card of the same grade, which is really, really good. However, this is the only Cradle Marker enabler we have. We're not really all in on the Cradle Marker archetype in any way. And it's only when it's rode over, so you have to, and we only play 2 copies of this, so you're pretty unlikely to make a Cradle Marker ever. Also, if your opponent isn't calling any units, you're not going to have a target for that effect. And then it has, when it's put on G or attacks a grade 2 or greater Vanguard from R, Soul Blast 1, and your opponent chooses one of their standing rear guards and may retire it. If they didn't, you draw a card, and all of your front row units get 5k until end of turn. So it's a nice little defensive effect. You can make the opponent choose between losing power or losing an attack, or giving you more power and a card draw, which might be the difference between you taking a bunch of damage and being able to guard. Next, we have 1 copy of Atrocious Mothgirl Maple. This is a pretty decent value-generating card. When you place a grade 3 or greater Vanguard in the ride phase, if you don't have a Maple in play, you call this from drop to R. So a free unit is always good to have, and we have lots of ways to get use of that out of this. Also, it being base 10 with no modifiers is fine because we can use Malignantis to shrink the opponent's Vanguard's power. So this will probably always hit. And on top of that, we're perfectly fine calling over this with the card we call from the deck with Gredora, and we're also perfectly fine just putting this in the soul for Malignantis or doing whatever with it. Next, we have 4 copies of New Face Mutant Little Dorcas. This card checks the top 5 for a grade 3, adds it to hand, and then discards the card when you place it from hand. And then it gets 5k if your opponent has no standing units. So 13k booster or attacker, and then a good way to dig for our Mythiarq Larutzal. Then we have 3 copies of High Class Moth. This is a staple card in all megacolony decks, I think. It counts as a grade 3 in Deck or Soul, which is nice. There's some synergy there. And then it has Act from R, rest this unit and put a normal unit from the drop on the bottom of the deck. Countercharge and choose one of your opponent's rear guards, and it can't intercept, and you can only use this effect once per turn. Hard once per turn clause, so you can't play additional copies of this to get it. Countercharge is really, really good in this deck, and it's very important that from turn 3 onwards, you are countercharging with High Class Moth every single turn. Next, we have 3 copies of Mythiarq Risumi. This is our other Mythiarq unit. It has from drop, if you place a grade 3 or greater Mythiarq Vanguard during a ride phase, you perform one of the following. If you have no copies of this card in play, you call this to R, and then if you have a copy already, you Soul Blast one and put it on the bottom of the deck and draw. So getting some recycling, getting a little bit of card draw from the drop zone for Soul Blast 1 is pretty good. And then in back row center, during your turn, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, all your front row units with Mythiarq get 5k. So our Vanguard will always be Mythiarq, and then the Restander will be Mythiarq, and that means we're getting at least 2 units with plus 5k, potentially 3 units 5k if we go into another Restander. So this card's pretty good. It also is the 3rd Mythiarq unit we need in order to trigger Delphina's ability to retire itself and grab back a Mythiarq. We don't really want to grab this one back because it calls from drop or puts itself back into deck and draws, so we'd like to leave it in the drop zone when it's there, but we want to grab Larutzal. Next, we have 2 copies of Brilliant Blister. This card is a very good defensive card. First off, on back row R, at the end of your turn, if your opponent does not have any standing rear guards, you can bounce this to hand. And if you did, and you have 6 or less cards, you can Soul Blast one and draw. You probably won't get too much use out of that effect unless your hand's been completely depleted, but it's nice to have. And then when this unit's put on G, if your opponent's Vanguard is rested, Soul Blast one and discard a card, and you rest a standing unit, and it can't... you choose one of your opponent's rear guards and rest it, and then the unit can't stand until end of turn. That's how it's worded. This is really, really good. If your opponent's playing something like Shiranui, for instance, and they don't have a ladder active, they swing with their Vanguard, they stand their 2 units, and they spend 2 soul for that, which is expensive, and then you immediately guard the first one they attack with this plus triggers, and then you rest the other one, and their turn's over. If your opponent stacks all the triggers on 1 unit, and they have 2 units left, or if they just stack the triggers on 1 unit and they attack with something else first, rather, you get to immediately rest the highest value rear guard. If you can guard the Vanguard with this, you can rest whatever they have left after the Vanguard swing. There's a lot of situations this is pretty good. The only way your opponent can play around this really is by attacking with their highest value units first after the Vanguard and making their Vanguard big enough that you don't want to hard guard it with Brilliant Blister plus shield value. But we have G Guardians that specifically work with guarding the Vanguard, so oftentimes we do want to hard guard the Vanguard. And then we have 1 copy of Elementaria Sanctitude, Blitzorder PG, staple for almost all premium decks. Then we have 1 copy of Mythiarq Habitat. This has a Mythiarq name, which is important. It also has the effect that when it's you can choose it from deck when you would choose a unit card, and when it would be called from deck to R, you bounce it to hand instead. So our Vanguard's on play skill that'll check the top 7. We can call this, and then we can put it in hand, and we can use this to check the top 7 for a better unit. And this has, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, choose 1 unit card with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard, and call to R and shuffle. So this just helps fill out your missing board places with better cards. Then we have 1 copy of Bracing Angel Ladder. We don't really need any of the defensive ones because we can shut off the opponent's aggression with Gredora. We don't really need Forbital because we're not playing a lot of search targets for it that we want and play at the same time. We don't really need Radiance Caliburn, though that one could be nice for the countercharge and soul generation. But Bracing Angel Ladder will give us resilience to the opponent's interaction and will let us protect our Mythiarq units on the opponent's turn if they try to retire them. And most importantly, when we go into a Zeroth Dragon to try to kill the opponent, we give the opponent back access to their G-Guardians. And so by playing Angel Ladder on that turn, we're able to make sure they can't interact with our board and disrupt our combo. Then we have our triggers. 4 grade 3 heals. You can play one of the countercharge soul charge heal if you want. It's a very small difference, but it's one that'll give you slightly more resources. Whereas this one will give you more stride fodder, give you an anti-aggro effect when you're not on grade 3 yet, and can be grabbed with a Largolv. Then we have our crits, starting off with 4 stride crits, Riddled Honey. These pitch as a grade 3 per stride, so they're really good. And then 4 copies of the draw crit. Scissor Shot Mutant Bomb Scissor, which gets, you draw a card when you damage this, and then if you're grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Dark Face in its name attacks, put this into Soul and draw a card, and then choose a Vanguard and it gets 5k. And I believe Gredora has a Dark Face in its name, so I think that should let you activate this trigger to put into Soul and draw a card, which is pretty useful to have. Then we have 3 copies of Paralyzed Madonna, our PG draw trigger. We don't want to play perf cards in the main deck, and draw triggers are good to hit defensively, so we're happy to play these. We also don't have any way to generate protect markers in this deck unless we ride a suboptimal target. So having PGs instead of like crit sentinels or instead of just not playing any sentinels it's really important to play draw trigger PGs when you don't have any way to generate protects. Then we have 1 Bless Favor, the Stoicheia Over Trigger. This is one of the best over triggers in the game. It gives you 1 of every trigger effect when you drive check it, which is a huge swing in your favor. Even more so than most over triggers already are. Next we have our G-Zone, starting with 2 copies of Gredora. This is one of the most important strides in the game. Meta warping, format defining ability. This card can often completely gatekeep decks out of the top tier tables. And it can just determine who's meta relevant based on how hard they lose to this card. Every top tier deck before this card got restricted was either a deck that could ignore this card or had a good counter game plan for it, or was a deck that was so powerful that it was okay with losing to Gredora because it beat everything else. What this card does is, as an act skill, you counterblast 1 and flip a card in the G-Zone, and then until the end of your opponent's next turn, their units can't stand in the stand phase, and they can't call units other than from hand. So where that gets really nasty, G-Guardians count as being called from the G-Zone, so they can't G-Guardian. No superior calls from drop, bind, soul, or from deck. That's really important for a lot of decks. Top of that, stride units, G units, are placed in the same position as the heart card, if I remember the rules correctly. So if the opponent's Vanguard was rested, and you activate this effect, they can't stride without their G unit being rested unless they ride a new grade 3. And sometimes they're not going to draw a new grade 3, or they're going to be playing a crest deck, and the only valid target they have is another copy of their main grade 3, and they have something else instead that they can't ride. So this will occasionally cause your opponent to just automatically lose the game, because they won't be able to use their G unit, and they won't get triple drive, and then you'll be able to easily kill them the next turn after. It's a really, really powerful effect. And also, it stops tokens from being called, because tokens are called from a zone other than from hand, and so it completely shuts down tokens. So Katrina auto loses to this deck when you get the effect active, so Katrina has to play really strangely to make the matchup work. Really, really powerful effect. There's no understating how good this card is. In fact, it's pretty much the only good card we have in megacolony. And then it has auto on V when it attacks, Soul Blast 1, search your deck for a grade 3, call it to R, and give it 10k until end of turn. So that's why we play those search targets. It's just a nice way to get multi-attack out of our deck, and we can get grade 3s with utility in order to generate some value while we're doing it. This is a really powerful card, and it is the main reason we're here playing this deck. Next, we have 2 copies of Malignant Mutant Deity Malignantis. So this card has an act skill active on Vanguard or in the G-Zone. If it's on Vanguard, you can pay this with flip a card face up in the G-Zone. Or if this card is face up, you can pay it with Counterblast 1 and put a rearguard in the soul. Choose one of your opponent's standing rearguards and retire it. If you retired a card, you draw a card and countercharge 1, and if you didn't, choose on your opponent's Vanguard and it gets -10. That's a really powerful effect considering how weak our units are. And -10 is kind of like +10 plus 10 power to our front row. You can look at it that way. So we can potentially activate 2 of these because I'm playing 2 copies. This will cost you 2 CB, but that's doable because we have a countercharger that's really good. And this will shrink the opponent down to -7 if they're a 13k unit, and that will basically make everything in our deck really hard to guard. They'll have to hit defensives to get to a reasonable amount of power, and then maybe they can play the game, but if they don't, then they're probably just going to explode. And again, they can't G-Guardian because they're under Gredora. So this is a really, really good effect. And then if they have standing units, we get to kill them and refund the cost of this effect. So at least we didn't lose anything. And we have lots of ways to punish the opponent for leaving standing units in play. With our G-Guardians, we'll basically tempt them into resting. And if they don't, then we'll get a lot of value. And then this will potentially deal with their whatever they have left, and they'll be locked out of the game. Really, really important card to have access to. Always flip this when possible. Next, we have 2 copies of Opterandus, and realistically, you should be playing 1 copy of this and be playing a 3rd Malignantis or something else useful, but I currently have 2 copies of this. This has GB2, Counterblast 2, and discard a card from hand, and your opponent cannot call units to R until the end of their next turn. This includes from any zone, including from hand. And the primary use of this is the opponent has an empty board because they've been not calling stuff into Gredora, or they've been playing units that get rid of themselves and go to Soul or another zone or something. We can punish them for this and leave them unable to call anything, and all they'll be able to do is swing with their Vanguard. However, you will give them access back to their G zone. They'll be able to G-Guardian, and their units that they already have in play will stand, so they can sometimes still play the game. So you really have to be careful when you go into this. This is not Gredora's number 3 and 4. This is a niche card that sometimes does a really powerful effect. Then we have 1 copy of Overwhelm. This card has the effect that you can counterblast 1 and flip a card in the G zone, and you draw up to the same number of cards as the number of your opponent's resting rearguards, and if the number of your opponent's resting rearguards is 1 or less, this unit gets crit +1, drive +1. So you either draw a bunch of cards or you get a very threatening Vanguard, which is nice. And then it has a GB3 Dark Device. All of your units get 2k for each face-down card in your opponent's damage zone. So that's potentially up to 10k to all your units, which is effectively 20k to each of your columns. And that is pretty decent. So you'll go into this when the opponent's at like high damage or has a small hand and you just want to try to force through lethal, or when you're not ready to kill them and you just need to draw a bunch of cards and then hope you survive. Next, we have 1 copy of Suppression Mutant Deity Tarantus. This is our GB8. All your opponent's vanguards and rearguards lose their auto abilities and cannot intercept, and all your units get 5k for each of your opponent's resting vanguards and rearguards. So you want to use this when the opponent has a full board that's all rested, and this will potentially give you plus 30k to your board, which is really strong. That's probably good enough to force through lethal if you can, if their opponent's at high damage. And also paired with the fact that you get 2 restanders, so you can get 5 attacks with that plus 30 to everything. Pretty strong overall. It also doesn't cost any resources, so if your opponent leaves you with no face-up damage at the end of their turn, you can go into Tarantus in the late game and still have something to do that might kill them. Next we get to the Zeroth Dragons. I'll lay them both out here. We'll start with Megiddo because it's the more important one. So this card has the effect, it has Ultimate Stride, which means you can only stride into it by discarding a card with the same name as your Vanguard. And then it has, you also need 3 face-up cards in your G-Zone, so that's important to keep track of as well. And then it has Auto Counterblast 2. When this unit is placed on V, you may pay the cost. If you do, choose up to 5 cards from your hand or drop, call them to separate R, and until end of turn, they get 5k and auto. The end of the battle of this unit attacked, choose one of your other rearguards and exchange positions. So you swap their spots. This is a really powerful effect. This gives you access to all the units you've lost to your drop zone. If you want to play against Gredora and they've activated Gredora, you can actually just call stuff from hand and get this effect, which will be more than enough to pressure them. Keep in mind that Ultimate Stride removes your G-Zone from the game at the end of turn, so you have to win on this turn. Otherwise, you basically have nothing left. No G-Guardians and no more strides. You're doing nothing for the rest of the game. But this can give us potentially 10 attacks, which I'll show at the end after I'm done going through the G-Zone. And it's a really devastating pattern. 10 attacks, all with additional power, potentially with the opponent being at minus power because we have Malignantis. So we have a ton of CB. Like if we went up to 5 and we have like 4 CB available to us because we have a countercharger, then we can activate these effects together and devastate the opponent. It'll probably win the game every time we do that, especially if we back it up with ladder. Great closer, and this makes up for the weakness that megacolony acquired, where we run out of gas after turn 4 or turn 5. Now we have a Zeroth Dragon to go into to finish the game. So try to play aggressive and force the opponent up to high damage in order to make this card more threatening. Then we have Zeroth Dragon of Death Garden Zoa. This is also an ultimate stride, same rules as the other one, and it has on place, Counterblast 2, pay the cost. If you do, draw a card, choose a card from your hand, call to R, and until end of turn it gets continuous. This unit gets 99,999 power constantly, so you can't change its power. And then auto, when it deals damage to an opponent's Vanguard, your opponent loses the game. So that is a very scary effect. Pair it up with something like Death Warden Antlion, if I've understood the rules correctly. You can get Sentinel Restrict and 99,999 power. That can be basically impossible to survive if the opponent has a bad hand. They would have to dump all their shield value to deal with it. You can also, this safely lets you put all the triggers on the other units. So, if they guard that 99,999, then they have to somehow guard the other column, which will be very threatening. You can also put the power on a restander and get 2 swings with 99,999 power. And if either of those hit, you win the game. So it's a pretty powerful closer. It's good in really weird scenarios where Megiddo won't do the job because the opponent's at at low damage and we just need to get 1 hit through. So the opponent's been guarding really defensively and they've spent most of their hand surviving and they haven't been able to plus because of Gredora, but they have a small hand and they're at low damage because they've played really cautiously. We can go into Zoa and just surprise kill them out of nowhere. If you want to do the Sentinel Restrict play, you need the Antlion in hand, so keep that in mind. If you draw Antlion, sometimes it's worth holding on to. It also synergizes with Megiddo, so having it in your hand or in the drop is fine. And then, again, if you fail to kill the opponent with this, you lose your G-Zone forever, so you're not playing the game anymore. Next, we have our G-Guardians. I'll lay those all out. We have 2 copies of this card, 2 copies of this card, 1 copy of this card. So this is our G-Guardian Flipper. This is 7 stars Mutant Deity Relish Lady. GB1, when this unit's placed on G, turn another G-Guardian face up, and your opponent chooses 2 of their rear guards, and they may rest them, and if they did not rest 2 cards, you draw a card and countercharge 1, soul charge 1. Usually you're going to play this in scenarios where they can't rest them, because they're already rested, or because they otherwise don't have anything in play. So you're almost always going to play this as a G-Guardian that countercharges 1, soul charges 1, and draws a card. Pretty good. If you don't care if the attack hits, or if you can hard guard the Vanguard swing, then you can get a lot of value out of this. And we play 2 copies. Sometimes you want to go into this twice, just to countercharge 2, so you can try to kill the opponent with a Zeroth Dragon on the next turn. Then we have 2 copies of Binding Mutant Deity Cruebel. This has, when put on G, Soul Blast 1, and it gets 30k shield. And then your opponent can choose any number of rear guards and rest them, and if they do, it gets minus 10 for each one. So that's 45k shield total, bringing your Vanguard up to 58, if I've done my math correctly. That's pretty good defensively, and the opponent's often not going to want to rest those units. If they have spare back row units that they've left behind and not used, they can rest them, but then their other attacks will be smaller. And so it's kind of a hard choice for them to make. If they're smart, they'll make the choice that benefits you the least, but not every player is smart. And then we have Featherwall Mutant Deity Morphosian. This has, if your opponent, when it's put on G, if your opponent has 2 or less standing rear guards, he gets 10k shield. So just a 25k shield G-Guardian, which will guard most medium-sized attacks. Overall, the G-Guardians are kind of whatever, but this deck doesn't really need a massive amount of defensive power because we are taking away the opponent's unfair aggression. And then lastly, we have 1 Harmonics Messiah, which every premium deck has to play. So that is the G-Zone. I will show you now the hypothetical 10 attack kill combo. We'll start with Megiddo. We'll need to have, of course, Leruthzal as our Vanguard. We'll need to have discarded Leruthzal. Ideally, we'll show the maximum power setting. All also Persona Road, so we'll have 10k to the front row. Let me get the dice out. So 10k to the front row. And then we'll ideally, oh, sorry, the Megiddo needs to be on top. Ideally, we'll also have some other cards in Soul. Maybe some cards we put into Soul for the cost of Malignantis. Maybe an Angel Ladder that will play this turn as well to make sure the kill goes through. We're going to want a bunch of cards in Soul. Our G Guardian also Soul charges, so we can try to set this up on purpose. So this is our Vanguard. We're going to need to be at high damage. In an ideal world, we'll be at something like 5 damage. This will mean that we have the most amount of resources to pay for everything. We'll also need to be at high GB. We're not going to do this before we run out of Gredoras, so we'll have probably at least these 4 cards facing in the G zone. And let's say I did that double G Guardian play. So our G zone is pretty stacked. Not that we have a crest or anything, but it's important to note because we'll have 2 Malignantises ready to go. So we'll activate the Megiddo, and we'll assume that all the pieces we need were in drop. We'll get to call a bunch of cards out. And lastly, we'll call some kind of useless unit. You'll see why in a second. And we'll also preferably have like a unit in hand that we're good with calling. Maybe, in fact, a Deathworn Antlion if I'm wishing for whatever I want. And maybe a high-class Moth would be good here. If we have a high-class Moth, we can do this combo with less damage. So we put Counterblast 2 on place. We get the effect. And then we can Counterblast to activate Malignantis twice. That'll put a card into Rear to Soul for the first one. And then we can play another one of these. Rest it, put something on the bottom of the deck, and countercharge, and then do it again. With the second Malignantis, the opponent is now at -20 if they had no standing units. And then we'll lastly call something useful for the final attack. You'll see how this works in a second. Alternately, if we don't want to go with Deathworn Antlion, what we can go with is Risumi, which will give 5k to all of our Mythiarchs in the front row. So we'll get a lot of additional power of this over the course of the turn. I'll show it with Risumi, and then I'll remind you that it could have been Antlion or Giraffa, and we'll see what it would look like then. So this is our board. All of these are restanders, and they're all getting 10k to the front, and then they're also all getting an additional 5k from being called by our Megiddo. However, this unit will not have been called by that unless we had a ton of CB. Unless we weren't going to activate Malignantis, it wouldn't have been called by the Megiddo's effect, because whatever we call here, we're going to want to put into Soul with Malignantis because this is on place, so we have to do it in the stride step, and Malignantis is an act skill. We have to do it in the main phase. You can also just choose not to call one unit here, and you can just use stuff you already have in the last spot, or you can call stuff that you don't care about and use, like you can call a high-class Moth and activate it to countercharge, and then act like the Malignantis, like I showed you. I'll save myself some time here, and I'll separate a Giraffa to show the 2 options we have for finishing this combo. Okay, so here's how this works. These all have the ability that they switch places with another unit at the end of the battle. So we swing here. This is 25 to the opponent's -7k Vanguard if we activated 2 Malignantis. And then we get to switch places with the unit behind it. And we do the same thing over here. And we switch places with the unit behind it. And then we swing these, and we don't switch. And then we can swing with the Vanguard. This will do triple drive. Doesn't matter what our drive checks are at this point, because crits don't even matter here. We're doing this ideally when the opponent's at 5 damage. Then we can Soul Blast 4 at the end of the battle. Being careful to keep a grade 3 in Soul if possible. And this will trigger all of these restanders that will all restand and gain 10k power, which is important to note. So our front row ones are getting plus 25, potentially another plus 5k from the Risumes, which I wasn't keeping track of. This also would have been plus 5. Or if we didn't have Risume, they're getting 5k less. But now we can swing here and then swap with the back row version, and then swing here, swap with the back row version, and swing with these. And then the last one will swap with our back row center to give us one final attack. This attack will be the weakest one if we kept Risumi. However, if we went with Deathworn Antlion, we can Soul Blast a grade 3 to get Sentinel Restrict and crit. which is also really powerful. We can also set this up as one of the front row units and swing with us first to the opponents at high damage and just see if they're dead. And if they die to this, then we don't have to do anything. But if they live, then we can swap this with a restander in the back row. We can still shuffle around and still get the full attack pattern. Then, alternately, if we had Giraffe and we had 1 CB left over, we can counterblast and get 5k power for each of the rested units and draw a card, which might be dangerous if we're low on cards in deck, but it'll give us, theoretically, our biggest attack. So, if we count them up, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 attacks. All of which had good numbers because either they were benefiting from Persona Ride plus other stacking effects, or the opponent had -20 for Malignantis, or both. Ideally both, but it can be kind of hard to engineer and it costs a lot of CB. And realistically, you're spending a CB every turn for Gredora and then 1 to 2 CB on Malignantis every turn. So you can't always get this ideal scenario unless you healed a bunch or countercharged very efficiently and were careful with resources. It's hard to get the perfect setup. But if you do, this is basically an unsurvivable turn. These numbers are all very hard to guard on a -7k Vanguard. This alone was like 40k to a -7. That's an absurd amount of shield. And that is probably going to get you the win. If it doesn't, you're out of cards and you can't do anything for the rest of the game. You have no G-Zone. But doesn't matter. So that's the deck. Aside from this turn, you go for normal Gredora stuff. You only need 1 restander in play, and then you just use the other circle for the Gredora Superior Call, and you get value out of that. Calling over a Maple or something, ideally. And the deck is otherwise just doing the same stuff Gredora normally does. It's disrupting the opponent. It's playing kind of anemic attacks in the early game, and then pivoting into this very strong combo in the late game. You still have most of the same tricks Gredora has defensively. You lose out on some tech slots. You can't play Hanleys unless you change the list. You lose out on some stuff for specific matchups like end picks, and that's fine because we're making up for it by getting a much stronger aggression plan. So that's the deck. I hope you consider this deck seriously, even if you're not going to build it and play it yourself. It is a deck you need to be aware of because I think it's now the new best version to play megacolony with, and it's likely not going away anytime soon. This deck will probably keep megacolony relevant to the meta for a little bit longer. But that's all for now, and I'll see you next time.